Hello, welcome to the XY Chromies Podcast, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers talk about veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
I'm ready to go, Pierce.
Nice. Yeah, me too. So we just wrapped episode 22, and we're doing a two-parter today. So we're on episode 23. We're going to be going on more into communism. Globalization is another part of the Globalization series where they'll be talking about communism and the West's response to communism, and more on Stalin as well. Do we have another good news story, or should we just jump right back into it?
I'd say the good news story is that the Soviet Union ended in 1991, but what followed wasn't a good news story.
But we're in a Cold War again right now. But I guess it's good news that it's not a hot war. So there you go. Right. Good news. So anyways, as a quick recap, because this will be coming out a week after what we were talking about, even though we just finished talking about it, we have come up to the death of Lenin. We talked about the union of the Soviet Union that happened in 1922, the death of Lenin and the takeover of Stalin in 1924. And we've talked about the mess that Russia had been and was for this leading up to this period of time, and then afterwards as well. But this is our globalization series, and so we've really focused a lot about Russia and communism recently, and there's got to be a common theme, because I think the final point that you were making, Richard, so I can put a seal in this cap, was that all of this was happening. We wanted to highlight why the West became so afraid of Russia. And we were trying to set the stage for this. But then through our off-screen machinations, we remembered that some stuff happened between 1924 and 1945 where the West really didn't pay too much attention to Stalin or Russia, and because Russia was still a mess. And I think that's a good starting point, because we have to remember they had lost the Russo-Japanese War and then gone in to one of the most costly wars in everyone's history of World War I, where they lost devastating loss after devastating loss, to the point where it sparked a revolution. That revolution sparked a civil war, and more revolution, essentially, and civil war / revolution, all of which there was famines there. Russians have been dying for 20, 25 years from all of these tragedies. These people were exhausted from this. And as you can imagine, all of this loss and all of this chaos would lead to a lot of chaos even after Stalin had taken over power. And so that's my summary. Did I miss anything there?
I think you've really hit it. And ultimately our objective is to get to the end of World War II, which is the pivotal point in our globalization series. And the piece that I want to bring from last week's episode is that it's Stalin did a lot of stuff. I mean, so I want to mention, like, there was a brief period of time in the 1920s when even though the Bolsheviks had created their communist structure, that they had to concede a little bit and let small business and commercial entities get into some free trade and so forth. Like they allowed some capitalist commerce to happen because their economy was so devastated by the end of the war and by the internal conflict. And they put a pin back in that again once things got stabilized just enough. But there were also, like we were talking about how there was a cynical attitude towards the peasants in Russia as not being smart enough to understand what communism could do for them.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a major initiative to get public schools started in Russia to get free education to people so that the literacy rate could come up. So we have a schizophrenic feeling about Russia, if anything else, because it's really hard for us to view it without the lens of the mid-century and see it for what it is now looking back. But at the time, they were trying stuff out, and they were trying stuff that was progressive in ways that we would appreciate in the West as, progressive ideas about making people's lives better, if for no other reason they had these concepts of franchise and these concepts of people participating in education, getting it. Like, there was a time before the fall of the Soviet Union where there was a technician class in Soviet Russia that was highly effective at developing weapon systems and space machines and computing and maintaining their arsenal of nuclear weapons.
To be fair, as I've learned more and more about Ukrainian history, we could say that was not insofar in due large part to the Ukrainian peoples and country as well. They were the closest to the West as well. There's a lot of technology, like university, that appeared in Ukraine. And as we've seen with their becoming the premier drone warfighting country in the world, essentially at this point, with their innovation and stuff, clearly we can see the remnants of that. In fact, the Soviet Union, 40% of their economy came out of Ukraine. Like, this country propped them up. There's a reason why Russia wants Ukraine now so badly.
Yeah.
There is a reason why they want that fertile farmland, the oil fields, and the access to the Black Sea ports. Ukraine is a lovely country that Russia does not want to let go, because it does represent a not so insignificant portion of their commerce, their trade, and their brain power, their intellectual, technological power as well. So, yeah, and Russia has always had some mathematicians as well. Brilliant mathematicians have come out of Russia despite all of this tragedy in this country. It's quite incredible to be frank. I mean, ones that could rival Einstein, honestly. Frederick, these guys were really brilliant.
So to give the audience, like, where we're at here, if I didn't say it earlier, I was ramping up to this to say this, which is it's not what Stalin did, which kind of is in the wash because it was a lot of murder and some progressive ideas. It's who he scared. It's who he frightened as a result of kind of the balance of all of it. And who he frightened was the United States. We, as a nation and as a culture, looked at the Soviet Republic and saw a type of terror that still lives in the fiber of our being. And part of that terror was essentially the distinction between how we see private property and how the communist system saw private property, because they consolidated industry and land into this communist system for the good of the state, but always at the loss of the individual. It always hurt people at the inflection point where property was being taken and who it was being given to. And so that's like oversimplifying our fear and terror of the Soviet Union, because there's so much more to it, especially when you layer in the mismanagement of these resources, their total ineptitude at logistics, and the murder campaigns that were going around to get people in line. These would all kind of assemble together to make this image about the Soviet Republic as a terrifying nemesis to our way of life. It's who we feared. We totally were terrified that something could come of Stalin's crazy works that would spread around the globe and infect our nation. And the same thing would happen to us as happened to the Russians in 1917, 18, 19, 22.
Well, and that's because the Communist Manifesto, or the idea behind communism, the ideology behind communism, didn't comport with the reality of human nature, frankly.
No.
I mean, and that was the biggest problem, is that fundamentally, it's like when you learn neoclassical economics, when you're taught about economics in the US, and this is the standard model of which you're taught. There's some, if you're teacher is worth his salt at all. Maybe they'll do some heterodoxy economics in your macro and microeconomics classes, but generally neoclassical economics is the model that's taught. They use math, calculus liberally to make their models work when they can. But if anyone's done the economics, done these courses, there's a lot of variables and equations and things that we leave out to make the math work. So much so that when you start to actually try to rationalize what economics is explaining to you, you're like, wait, this doesn't actually make sense, or this doesn't work. People aren't logical actors and decision makers at all time who make the best efficient choice when they're selecting products, right? We realize that people absolutely don't do that. There's things called advertising and manipulation, and all these other things. So just like that, communism goes to say, like, hey, what if everyone was ideal and everyone has each other's best interest in mind, and we'll all collectively make the best decisions for everybody all the time? It was this idea that, like, what if humans suddenly have everyone has an aneurysm at the same time, and suddenly we're not human. We're a better version of humanity. The way that Marx wrote it, at least, and Engels wrote it, I could see that maybe they just thought, like, oh, well, suddenly humans will be a higher person. It honestly didn't make any sense. Did they not pay attention to human nature or see people and the way that they acted when given freedoms? Will they see how people acted when they're given power? It was as if they agnostically ignored the humanistic nature of hierarchies and just said, the system is the way it is, and it's not made of people at all, which is exactly, actually, unironically, it makes sense that they're economists, because that's what economists do. They ignore the human part of people within the economy. And that's why these economic models fail to work, is the driver of the economy, we're saying that they're not a human. They're not a person. That doesn't matter. That doesn't comport with the equations, because that makes the math too hard. And I think that at a fundamental level, that was the issue with communism. And not only that, but it gaslights the proletariat, the working class, into thinking that this will be the system that will benefit you. This is where you'll have the most freedom. When anyone in a capitalist country understands that having ownership of something, yourself, your freedoms, your liberty, that is as much freedom as that you can get within a civil society. Having ownership, the ability to vote and voice your opinion freely without the fear of repercussions. Of course, there's social repercussions in the world. You can't just say whatever you want. I like to remind people, when they talk about free speech, you still say something, get punched in the face if you say the wrong thing. You're free to accept the consequences, I believe, is the term, if you're free to speak something. But I digress. Communism was a gaslight. It gaslit the American people, or it would gaslight the people into following it, potentially. And that was a huge fear that we definitely had here.
Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. I want to let the audience know that if you're not aware of these two names in economics, Kahneman has written with Tversky and his own work without Tversky, because Tversky passed away a few years ago. Daniel Kahneman is our historical person who led the way in actually figuring out and writing about how people actually work, how we actually function. And one of the main takeaways from Kahneman and Tversky's work is that the human mind in an economic scenario is biased towards loss aversion. And so we'll make decisions that seem totally irrational from a free market perspective if you try to map us to classical economics. But if you look at it from a loss economics perspective, we're totally rational that way. And so if the audience wants to know more about Kahneman and Tversky, I recommend Michael Lewis's book, The Undoing Project. And you can get a really more nuanced understanding for how it is these two brilliant researchers discovered the way that we function as a species. Like the problem with small sample sizes is you get distorted understandings of how larger populations work. Like they discovered these things. They seemed like they're obvious to us now,
Yeah.
but it took Kahneman and Tversky to be the innovators behind it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the West is afraid. They're afraid of communism spreading, but we weren't really too afraid of it until after World War II. I think that's when it really started. And to put this into context, the U.S. was, if we're talking about the U.S. was going through some stuff through the 1920s to the 1940s. A lot of things were happening to us internally that we had let build up. There was a lot of lax regulation around the banking industry and credit, and there was inflation got out of control in the 1920s to the point where we had a Great Depression that was also in parallel to one of the worst famine events that the U.S. had experienced with the Great Dust Bowl, which not only wreaked havoc on the farmer class, but created a great migration event to the cities. The rise of industrialization had happened within the U.S. as well, and the factory work that the Ford plant had put forth in that model was also happening. And labor conditions, just like everywhere else, were pretty poor. And so that is kind of the scene of the 1920s and 1930s in a nutshell. I'm kind of smushing it all together. We see the first rise of labor unions within the U.S. Large labor union movement happened during this period of time. And a lot of workers' rights and things started to become a thing in the 1930s in the U.S. as well. So we were dealing with a lot of internal strife and problems. So I don't think we were paying too much attention to Russia at this point. And Richard and I talked offline. We were a little bit more focused on Hitler and the German Party when they had taken over in the early 1930s, essentially, and they had won some seats. We were very afraid of them. And before that, even, we were nervous about Japan. So yeah.
So I want to bring into contrast a thing that we've really forgotten about because the Great Depression is such a terrific story in our nation's history. It lasted for so long. It was consequential in the creation of the social safety net that didn't exist before during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 3 terms in office.
Mm-hmm.
The 1930s signify these changes that took place in America that were technological for sure, and also there were brand new ideas about how to organize our civilization. But I want to bring into contrast something that up until the Great Depression, it turns out there were recessions and depressions that happened every 7 years leading up to that time on average.
Like every 3 years, actually. Yeah, it was like over 3 years. Now it's like every 7 years since we got off the gold standard. We actually have more consistent and less frequent recessions.
So, you can, again, we're going to our favorite. By the way, when I talk about Wikipedia in this conversation, it's a totally appropriate research tool for what we're doing. We're taught in academia that it's not. And we would never list a Wikipedia article as a reference in one of our academic papers. So I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek when I say, I'm going to Wikipedia to get this absolute answer.
To be fair to Wikipedia now, teachers have no problem saying it's a good starting off point. Like it's fine to start there because it will ultimately send you down some pretty decent links. But you definitely shouldn't write your paper with just Wikipedia. But I don't know. I don't think, one of our favorite teachers, she didn't have a problem with it. One of your friends also, she had no problem with us starting off there, but not quoting it and obviously not citing it.
Yeah.
So
I remember specifically, I took some of the best classes I ever had in college from.
Yeah. So
list of recessions in the United States. This is a Wikipedia page. There have been as many as 48 recessions in the United States dating back to the Articles of Confederation.
Nice.
So 48 recessions. The cyclical volatility of the GDP and unemployment was greater before the Great Depression than it had been since World War II. but the Great Depression really it lodges in our minds because of its recency, one, but two, because of its duration and intensity.
Yeah.
I'm not going to now divulge or divert tangent. There we go. Tangent's the right word. I'm not now going to go, hey, Pierce, want to talk about the stock market crash of 1929 and talk about the Great Depression at length? No, but let's just say that happened.
Yep.
What I want to bring into stark contrast, though, is what came right before it. I'm scrolling down to the middle of our Wikipedia page to find
anarchy and chaos and flapper girls came before it. Just wokeism, Richard. It was pure wokeism. Didn't you know? Is that where we're going?
Terrific. I found this terrific. I found this terrific documentary on the history of tractors. And I know our audience probably is divided between model airplane enthusiasts, train spotters, and tractor fans.
Yeah.
So I know for the third of you who are tractor fans, you love this.
That's right. John Deere.
I'm sorry, model airplane enthusiasts. We're not going to touch on your topic of interest. So the history of the tractor is interesting, really, to farmers and nerds like me, and to economists, because the tractor is this thing that came into existence through a series of evolutionary steps in technology, but it was the foundational type of machine that led to the creation of tanks and to track trucks and tactical vehicles. And so during World War I, our industrial system was engaged, and we were cranking out things that made parts for tanks and trucks and tactical vehicles for the war effort. Some of them we were selling to Britain, some of them we used ourselves, but we were in a war footing economy. Well, it turns out, if you don't have a military industrial complex, when the war ends, you get the post-World War I recession.
Mm-hmm.
So from August 1918 to March 1919, 3 years, 8 months, we went into a recession that was followed in 1920 and 21 by a depression. And, we're using these indicators of employment and GDP as the way of measuring whether something is a recession or a depression.
Yeah.
So 1920 and 21 are years away from 1929. But the 1920s had a sort of soar and plunge problem of the stock market. And ultimately, one of the things that got us into trouble was how there were laws that allowed Americans to buy stocks on margin, or to buy stocks on credit, basically.
It was that, yeah. Use your credit to buy stocks. So,
which at the time totally made sense, because there were people that were becoming overnight millionaires. But just like every financial instrument that we invent and try out for a few years, we found out that it was the world's worst idea. I mean, later in 2008, we found out that the way that we were using real estate as a basis for investment turned out to be a terrible idea too.
Yeah, well, when the banks completely lose all of their moral scruples and start handing out loans to like a family who had just immigrated here 3 months ago and had, $10 in their bank account that they just set up, and they were like, yeah, that'll do. I mean, and yeah, it was, It
was even more than that. And not to put a color tone on immigrants as being homeowners. You had people that were flipping houses. You had people that were,
oh my God, yeah,
bootstrapping all these different things to hold together some type of real estate empire that they could turn over quickly and make quick money on.
Yeah.
And you had people that were, so for the audience that's not a veteran, Pearson and I, being vets, have access to what's called a VA home loan guarantee, where we can kind of buy real estate outside of our ordinary means, because it guarantees up to a certain amount of finances for a home.
Mm-hmm.
For the For the typical consumer, though, something that was not the same as the VA home loan guarantee, but close enough, was allowing people to buy homes at valuations that massively exceeded their ability to repay the loan, and they were variable rate mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
So there was in the early, let's see, 2006. So this is mid 2000s. So by the mid 2000s, I'm totally off of this tangent now, because I want to actually clarify that it was a major difference between what caused the stock market crash in 2008,
Yeah.
2007, 8, and what caused the stock market crash in 1929. They're very different things. They still had consequences. But what caused the stock market crash in 2007 and 8 had more to do with a global pool of liquidity, where people were looking for investment opportunities and instruments, and would call them financial instruments because they're just things we make up on paper, and then we can use those as ways to invest money.
Yeah.
And so what was happening was this combination of real estate being sold in the United States to people who couldn't really pay the loan. They just couldn't. And betting on the defaults. We were gambling that these people would not repay the loan.
Yes. And then insurance was insuring these loans. Yes. The insurance companies, our entire insurance market was in on it, because they were just making so much money. They were like, of course we can insure this. There won't be any repercussions for this. Next thing you know, you have AIG bailout, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, boom, boom, boom. And so there was a lot of regulatory non-compliance. A lot of people looked the other way. A lot of people were profiting. Yeah. What was happening technically were completely different things. The effects were pretty similar, and the players trying to become greedy and overnight millionaires, all these things, the common throughput would be greed, lack of oversight, lack of government oversight, lack of regulation. And these things happen. These things happen over time. A really interesting book series that can kind of lay out, and I know, me and Richard have talked about this before, is Neil Howe and William Strauss's The Fourth Turning and Generations, their book that is before that, where they lay out generational theory, and then The Fourth Turning lays out in more explicit detail kind of their theory of the cycles that America goes through. It's an American-centric historical demography type book that talks about cycles and economic cycles and cycles of war, political dissidence, and so on and so forth. And so we're in that stage of where we're talking about in the 1920s is really like the third turning type of stage, where you saw a laxening of regulations. Really, after Teddy Roosevelt, you could say that that would be the third turning period of time, and third turning is marked specifically by regulations loosening within the market, and the government oversight weakening. Government's antitrust laws, which had been kind of formed and created at the turn of the century, specifically to break up Standard and Oil, those were weakening very fast. In fact, Standard and Oil was conglomerating again by the 1920s. They were already trying to acquire companies that they had been split up to. And by the way, Google, if anybody didn't know, technically Google was broken up 2 weeks ago by our U.S. government. I don't know how this isn't a big news story.
Hey, what a good news story.
It is a really good news story. Oh my God, we need to talk about this more. I've only read the headline so far, and I was like, I need to actually turn and focus on this a lot more to find out what happened. But in the future, we should talk about what happened to Google. But anyways, so after Teddy Roosevelt, and we started to see the lax of regulations, which led to financial shady business, financial funny business, as we saw. That 1920s is marked by a lot of financial funny business, which, as history has always proven, we see, cause and effect. The 1930s was really a referendum. I mean, we saw the climax effects in 1929 of the Great Depression, and then the referendum on the effects on the people by the government really starting to implement tons and tons of labor-related programs, the New Deal forms, labor unions, we start to see the government try to fight back for the people who had been devastated by the last decade of economic strife.
One of the things that I want to describe also about the 1920s is it's a populist era. So populism is something that we're experiencing now. It's part of why Pearson and I want to talk about globalization, because American populism is the antithesis of globalization. I think we could put it that way. It's sort of a referendum on globalization the way that we've done it. So there's a populist period during the 1920s where America as a there's no one thing called America because of all of our federal system, and the states are different, and the cultures are different. But kind of as a people, we said we don't want to be involved in Europe's drama. We never wanted to be. We are this thing over here divided by this moat called the Atlantic Ocean that keeps us out of their business. We don't want them meddling in ours. So what's the Monroe Doctrine? I think it was that kept Europe out of. It was the beginning of the end of the colonial period in the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
Is how we sort of pushed this so that we were the hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere, not Europe.
Yeah.
And now we're pulled into this war. We've lost soldiers in this war. We've blood and treasure. Do I need to bring up the sinking of the Lusitania? Because that was part of what got us into World War.
Yeah.
And now we're in a populist period. So one of the things that comes out of populist periods is where we start looking inward. So that's nice. And then we make laws and treaties and enact tariffs and do any number of legislations. We put into effect any number of legislations that isolate us from the world as a we're trying to put a bigger and bigger boundary between us and the economics / cultural / government entities in the outside world. The reason I'm bringing up populism is because it can kind of give you a sense of why Russia and the Soviet Republic, the Soviet Union, what they were doing during this time would have been low on our radar. It would have been one of the things that we were trying to get ourselves some distance from.
Actually, and unironically or coincidentally, or maybe just in parallel, Russia was dealing with was being populist as well during the same exact period. We could say after Stalin implanted himself, he had a huge mess to deal with. He had to look inward. It was a lot of, Russia wasn't conquering, outer nations so much during this period of time, especially after the Poland debacles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these agreements with Germany. World War II would really mark the period where Russia would be able to expand and get all of that land back. But until then, Stalin was putting out many of the fires that Lenin and even Nicholas the Tsar had made during past follies, and putting out plenty of new fires that he had created due to trying to use communism to enact systems of control and regulating the government through communism, which it didn't work because it wasn't like I said in the last episode, and maybe I haven't said it here, communism was really good at facilitating the consolidation of power. Yes. And so if you wanted to consolidate power, communism was the trick to do it. For running a government, for figuring logistics out properly, and for running an efficient economy, communism was over and over again a nightmare. And this is what Stalin was running into during these 1920s and even the 1930s. So there was populism happening there, a completely different version of populism here. Unironically, populism was happening over there at the, against many of the poor people who were experiencing it. Populism in the US, in stark contrast, was actually pretty good for people and labor workers when we get into the 1930s. We start to see, and I don't want to gloss over that labor unions had to fight for the rights that they got. And there was violence between corporation and the labor. There was violent clashes throughout the country. There was unrest. There was unrest during this period of time. It was a fight. There were workers fighting for their rights. It really was a fight. And this was all happening during the 1930s under when was FDR originally elected? 1928 or
No,
19?
no, I want to say 32.
I'm
Good thing
thinking
we have the
32
internet.
also.
While
Yeah.
you're looking that up real quick, let me just say that if the audience is interested in a People's History of the United States, which is literally the title of the book by Howard Zinn, The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and you'll get a picture of labor, the conflict between labor and capital in the country. And it's depressing. I mean, you know, every few years there's some conflict where there's a Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire and there's some retribution about it, and there's some form, and then it kind of goes back to being what it was again. But the 1930s is when that began to get the modern version of labor improvement. We can really point at the 1930s. Go ahead. Roosevelt was? FDR was?
1933 is when he when he began his presidency. March 4th, 1933 was his inauguration. So he was elected in 1932. Nice date. That's good. Yeah.
I'm actually terrible at dates.
It's good.
I just thought, well, Coolidge was still president into the 30s, and it would have been an even year. So he must have been elected in 32.
Oh, Calvin. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, FDR takes over 1933, when I'm thinking of labor unions and I start to think of the rise of labor unions in the US around 1932, 1933. For some reason, that date rings true in my head, and it might not be a coincidence that FDR took his first term then also. So, but I'm not, I'd have to look up the actual start of the labor unions, the date, but yeah. And so
Hoover, sorry.
Hoover. Oh my gosh. Okay. Oops.
Of course. Well, how could I do so?
Calvin Coolidge is before. He's early.
Before Hoover.
Yeah. Before
Hoover was president. Hoover was president until 33. And the reason why you and I care about Hoover historically is because this is one of the early conflicts between veterans and our federal government that lays out the natural history of the Veterans Administration.
Mm.
And if you've ever heard of the term Hooverville, it might be describing something that's kind of a trashy development of buildings or kind of poorly constructed shanties. So this is a story that we should go into sometime after our series is either wrapping up or we start a new series.
Sure.
But this is the conflict that our veterans from World War I had with the Hoover administration, because the Hoover administration does bridge the 1920s and Great Depression has taken place.
Yeah.
And they were asking for those benefits that they were promised to go to war.
Yeah.
And the Treasury was, being taxed, pressured, I guess, or is a better way to put it. But the Treasury is being pressured, and Hoover didn't think it was important to give a bunch of vets an injection of money during this crisis. Probably would have made all the difference in the history of the country had that happened. But no, not into it. So my mistake, I said Coolidge. I was wrong. Coolidge was before Hoover. Let's never forget about Hoover.
That does bring up a really fun idea. Maybe we eventually, I'd say, put this in the notes for our listeners to remind us, hopefully in the comments at some point, but we could do a history of the veteran, the history of the veteran within the U.S., like the Department of Veteran Affairs, how that came about, how those rights were fought throughout the time, because it has been a fight. And I think me and Richard have mentioned very much so that really we have gotten some of the best benefits that any veterans have ever gotten within U.S. history have happened under our tenure of military service. So, which is very recent and pretty far away from the 1930s that we're talking about even then. So, yes, screw you, Hoover.
There is a political movement in our modern times that would like to take us back in time.
Yes.
We'd like to reset that progress we've made.
Let's
move on.
Yeah.
I thought I would read for the audience a little more of Wikipedia.
Nice.
Richard's Wikipedia corner, because it addresses where we're at now in history. We're in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah.
We've talked about how America's looking in on itself. We're putting in place tariffs that are actually going to come to hurt us really badly later.
Yes.
Because they affect the Japanese. We're going to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's a really good point. So I did earlier say populism was actually pretty good internally for the U.S. There was a lot of good things. Like infrastructurally, we were starting to build interstates and roads, and there was all these capital improvement projects that were actually upgrading our infrastructure, from the electric grid to dams to roads to interstates. All of these things were starting to percolate and happen with the rise of the labor movement. So there's a lot of really internal popular things that happen with populism. But U.S. has this tendency when it does go populist that we go full populist, right? Like I think Tropic Thunder says never go full retard. Excuse the parlance of my phrase there, but it's just a quote. You never go full populist, but the U.S. does this. We did this at the turn of the century, and we did it again here. And what I mean by that is our international relations, our policies internationally become so isolationist that it actually gets to, and I pass this back to Richard as he chuckles at my Tropic Thunder quote.
I just love the idea that we're quoting the great philosopher Robert Downey Jr. to use moderation when doing anything.
A black-faced Robert Downey Jr. no less too, I will say. The last, blackface that made it through our modern culture that somehow survived. All
right, I'm going to read from the Wikipedia page on the
I'm sorry, Tropic Thunder. Probably my most controversial take. That movie still slams. It's one of the best movies ever, and also one of the best Tom Cruise movies and performances of all time. I just want to say
it aged really well.
Really well.
When it first came out, it was not really well received, but it's aged way better than it ever had any right to. All right, here we
go. Okay,
we're back to the government of the USSR. So I'm just going to read from this section from Wikipedia. Oh, excuse me. No, we're talking about
the U.S.
About the government. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm reading about the revolutionary beginnings and chairmanship, 1922 to 1940. The heading here for
come a little bit closer. Wikipedia. Your mic is cutting out suddenly for some reason. The last minute or so. Yeah, I don't know. Something's. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Check the connections. We had some technical difficulties.
Yes. Okay.
The 1924 Constitution differentiated between all Union and unified, referred to as Republican, from 1936 onward. I'm talking about the Soviet Union right now. So the 1924 Constitution differentiated between all Union and unified, referred to as Republican from 1936 onward, People's Commissariats. The People's Commissariats for Justice, Internal Affairs, Social Security, Education, Agriculture, and Public Health remained Republican-level ministries. This is within the organization of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
In the meantime, the commissariats for foreign affairs, commerce, and industry, transport, military, navy affairs, finance, foreign trade, labor, post, and telegraphs, supply, and the interior were granted all Union status. This system created troubles at first, since neither the Constitution or any legal document defined the relations between all Union commissariats and their origins in republics and the separate unified Republican Commissariat. However, this system was kept with minor changes until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, I read that paragraph to give the audience kind of a, like, I don't even know what you read, Richard. It was just a whole bunch of words about communism went over my head. Essentially, what it's describing is how the Soviet Union organized from the 1924 Constitution, how it organized and differentiated different industries and services within the country. The 1936 Constitution defined the Council of People's Commissars as the Soviet government, and conferring upon it the role of the highest executive administrative organ of state power. To come back to that here in a second. The Constitution stripped the Council of People's Commissars of power to initiate legislation, and instead confined it to issuing decrees and regulations on the basis and in execution of the laws currently in force. Only the Supreme Soviet and its Presidium, having replaced the Congress of Soviets, had the Central Executive Committee and the Central Executive Committee, respectively, could alter laws. And so what I'm hopefully communicating here is
How a
This is
dictator
one
happens.
more, yeah, this is one more move power to Stalin. So Stalin's power grab
Can I
in the
stop you there for a
1930s.
second? Because
go ahead.
So it's really interesting because 1924, a dictator takes over for another dictator.
Yep.
But he doesn't have full control of the government. Because and this is really important. I want to hammer this down because I need Republicans in our country to hear this very closely. MAGA Republicans, the ones who love Trump, that you like fucking love this guy. Understand, when the Democrats have been saying this guy is a dictator or he's going to be a dictator, or he's going to be an authoritarian, and you guys jump to Hitler or Stalin or Xi, even, for the love of God, understand that dictators don't just happen overnight. They happen over time, like everything else. Dictators don't start off totally terrible most of the time. They can't. They don't have the power. They do not have a power. Even when a dictator takes over a government, or coups a government, or revolts, it is a very dangerous time for all parties. And for years and years afterwards, it's very dangerous. And right now we're seeing Burkina Faso and all these other countries that are having revolts. They had a revolt a couple of years ago in Burkina Faso, but they'll have another one. Nigeria right now is facing this again, and they haven't had a revolt for over a decade now, so they felt like they were fairly secure. But there's a lot of so when these overthrows happen, there's really tenuous period of time. For a long time, there's a consolidation of power that has to happen. It doesn't just happen overnight. Xi wasn't just dictator for life over the CCP right when he took power. It took him just last year in 2023, he finally removed one of the last vestiges of potential power rivalries that he might have. It was the person that put him in power, by the way, because that's the way dictators work, is they take they'll leave their friends to the end, and then they have to root out corruption within their own party, and they look really great. Oh my God, they removed his best friend. It's like, yeah, he removed his rival finally. So you need to understand Republicans, and I know it sounds like I'm preaching to you or whatever, but this is something that I've learned through reading about these characters and about dictators over time. It happens over time. It's slow sometimes. I mean, the funny thing is Stalin and Lenin never really said out loud that they were going to be dictator on day one. There's no recording of them saying that shit. I mean, I would like to make a stark contrast to Trump, who has said he will suspend the Constitution. Another thing that I was curious about when you brought up the Constitution of 1924, and that was the Constitution above the premier at that time as far as a living document, or structurally was it still below Premier Stalin when that Constitution, which still gave power to, it sounds like, the Congress, which still existed at the time?
I think I'd have to read from the previous
Oh, that's okay.
paragraph to get us there. But as I'm skimming over it, I'm essentially, you've hit upon something that's a key distinction in our current, and we swear an oath to, Constitution, is that it is the highest law of the land. We have this is a brilliant idea. We actually have a mechanism for amending it. There are many amendments. We've made amendments and then gone back on those amendments because they were a bad idea. So the highest law of our land is in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution. This is a really important idea. We try to learn it in school. We never learn it well enough. Civics is hard. Teenagers don't care. It's
why people who do understand civics get so triggered when people like Donald Trump says he's going to suspend the Constitution on day one, or when he says he's going to do those things, and why it should be met if you are a part of a democratic republic, with which we are, a democracy. A democracy is a democratic republic. We're not a pure democracy, obviously, but we are a democratic republic. And under this, saying that you're going to suspend something that is higher than you in authority, which that paper is, and it's only empowered by us, the people who hold people accountable to that document. That's what that means. It means that everyone within our country must use that document and reference it when someone is trying to supersede that power.
So
And that's why I brought it up about Russia. And I wanted to know, because I kind of know the answer to this question. Is almost a rhetorical question. I feel like I could Google really quickly and find that constitution was below the premier. And absolutely, we know the 19, I mean, shit, they wrote it out, that all power consolidates to the premier, essentially, and his goons, I guess, who, enact his will.
So I've mentioned before that sometimes we struggle with seeing the distinction between the different governing systems. And well, isn't there a president and isn't there a premier? Isn't that the same thing? Our president serves it's a privilege to serve as a presiding executive in our government whose authority is below that of our documents of government. In this case,
the president is supposed to be an adverb. He presides. That's what the president isn't supposed to be referenced as a person. Was a premier, you could just replace the word premier with king, emperor, or whatever the fuck you wanted. That's the point. Premier is a person. Yes. It's a person who is ruling over everybody. A president is someone who presides over the office of which he takes counsel from everyone there and is controlled or at least barriered by the Constitution and the co-equal branches of government.
I'm laughing because I'm just being self-conscious about how animated you and I are. We are very passionate about this.
Well, it turns out civics is not boring. It's delivered boring. And civics is really quite fascinating. And it's fundamental to your understanding of the government and why things are the way they are and why America is so amazing of a country. Like
we swore to uphold the Constitution, the documents of our liberty as soldiers. And our Marine friends did it. Our Navy friends did it. Coast Guard friends did it. Our Air Force friends did it. We all swore to.
And our Space friend. I don't have Space Force friends, but I will have some Space Force friends at some point. I hope.
Our fellow vets swore our fealty to the Articles of Constitution, to our Bill of Rights, to the structures of our government above and beyond the personage of our executive. And the reason that I'm getting a little hot under the collar here is because there is a movement afoot in a political party that I could identify where that would not be the case, and that at every level of our military would be required to
swear service to the premier,
to swear fealty.
Yeah, premier.
To swear fealty to the executive. To swear fealty to the executive, which is an abomination in our system. And I want people to understand, when I use abomination, that is the highest insult I can possibly make about how that differs from the order that you and I swore to. That's why we're so passionate about this.
I mean,
that's why we talk about these stories with such passion.
We're talking about Russia because it can happen here. That's why we're talking about it so much. We're talking about it because it can happen here. And we're trying to make a case. It's a long case. It requires you having to listen to us ramble on for quite a few hours for why Russia might have something to do with it happening here as well, actively. They're currently actively engaged in this. One of the things I'd like to end on, I guess, wrap this part up because I think we have more to talk about here, is the idea of the dictator being a master at psychology, and how Stalin and Mao and Putin and Xi, probably Xi. I don't know Xi as well as him. He's very enigmatic, which in itself is a very powerful tool for him to wield, as China does wield in enigma better than the Russians even at this point. These people are masters at psychology. I track this Russian-Ukrainian conflict very closely and am constantly heartened by the lack of prowess with which Putin has at waging wars. However, Stalin didn't have any real prowess in waging physical wars either. And many of these dictators typically don't, but that is not their method of waging wars. Putin is a master of psychology. The war he is waging with us is a psychological one. And as he takes military defeats here in the Kursk region and Bryansk and potentially Belgrade, which are all really good things for the Ukrainians. And I wish them the best success at cutting off Belgrade before the muds come in, and we can talk about that later. But Putin is simultaneously might be physically not doing well in this war, but he is doing very well in the West right now. We have seen an unbelievable amount of proliferation, both natural and synthetic, by the Russians and Chinese of propaganda within the US, to the point where now we have useful idiots from Joe Rogan to, I'm trying to think of useful idiots I don't think are paid actors. So I'll just say useful idiots spouting Russian propaganda. RFK Jr., another one who I don't think is paid directly by the Russians, but no one spouts more Russian propaganda than RFK Jr. probably. Just that I don't think is paid. People like Tucker Carlson, who I do think are paid by Russian assets. I think Lex Friedman and other centrists, the trigonometry guys, many of these people I think are paid by the state of Russia in some form or fashion at this point. But we have a disinformation war that has been proliferated by the internet and social media. We've recently found out that there are multiple high-level official oligarchs of like the core of Putin's Russian oligarchs who have directly funded X's purchase, Elon Musk's purchase of X. And
this is a software program that was formerly called Twitter. It was a communication medium for people.
Yes, X, formerly known as Twitter.
It's now called this other thing that just sounds like everything else.
Yeah, it's just like all the other X platforms, full of garbage. So this is what's happening. These are the methods for which they're trying to influence us. I read an article recently that was saying Twitter has lost 70%. Investors have lost 70% of their investment in X since Elon took over. And I thought, well, that's funny because I know the major investors of X have been Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China. Now, if your goal is to sow disinformation and chaos within your foreign adversary, the West, I would say that it was one of the best purchases one of the best investments of their lifetime. Yeah. This idea that things are a poor investment, well, maybe from our perspective, we're a capitalist country. So if it doesn't bring profit or, increase gross margin or quarterly profits aren't going up, then yeah, it was a bad investment. But if your goal isn't a financial goal, if your goal is the destruction of our country, then the purchase of X was a discount. It was
stroke of brilliance.
Stroke of brilliance. Yeah.
If I may, as the author of this section of this Wikipedia page, I don't know them, but I do appreciate their how they wield the pen. If I may, I'm going to read this one last paragraph.
Sure.
It's under the chapter called High Stalinism, 1941 to 1953. Stalin's power grab in the 1930s had weakened the formal institutions of governance, both in the party and government. Scholar T.H. Rigby writes that all institutions had gradually dissolved in the acid of despotism, and that from 1946 until Stalin's death in 1953, only the most minimal of gestures were made to reverse the atrophy of formal organs of authority in both the party and state. It's not what he did, it's who he scared. And he terrified us during this period of time. So when I read the 1936 Constitution, had that little blurb before.
Yeah.
It's not really intelligible to us. It's kind of scrutable in a way. You can go look it up. There's a hyper.
All I heard was power was consolidated. Essentially, there was a period where power was still allowed to coexist with Stalin. And I imagine if we were to look through what was happening on the day-to-day and week-to-week and month-to-month, we would have saw Stalin's agents proliferating throughout these systems of government, consolidating power, removing people that, we saw the rise of his, the KGB and these, or before that, Lenin's police became the KGB eventually. And, the more him exercising those powers more and more to position himself into a place where it sounds like after that constitutional amendment, he really reigned fully supreme. The era of Stalin was truly, was really from 1941. That makes sense too. And he garnered tons of fear and respect from Churchill and FDR by the 1940s for sure, because the last thing they wanted was the Russians to go in with the Germans. That was a fucking nightmare.
And they had a treaty.
They had a treaty
before Hitler stabbed him in the back. They did.
And Stalin loved Hitler. He really liked Hitler. Like, weirdly, just really, he was so surprised that Hitler didn't feel the same way.
Yeah.
If Stalin would have been a better person, I would have felt bad for him, because he was so shocked. I mean, he went into hiding, or he was sick for like a week after he found out that the Germans were invading, even though they were like, they were going to be in Moscow in like less than a month. And he didn't take any calls. He went into his room for a while and moped or whatever he was doing there, probably drinking himself stupid because he was so pissed at himself for failing to see it. But I mean, he could have just read Mein Kampf and he would have known how Hitler felt about the Slavs, because he wrote about the Slavs quite a bit. And I will say
he did read it all, the quiet parts out loud.
He said the quiet parts out loud. And frankly, the Germans, I mean, Kaiser felt the same way about the Slavs, Kaiser Wilhelm before that. And I mean, this was, there was some definite ethnical or racial hatred between the Germans and the Russians. I mean, they had been fighting off and on for 400 years of history. So I can understand why animosity has been built up, similarly to the Chinese and the Japanese hatred of each other. When two countries fight each other for a long time, I can understand it. Yeah, it's very surprising that Stalin was so blindsided and just couldn't believe. It's funny. I think sometimes people build up and they allow their brain to fool them. I mean, even with Trump, we've seen that, like, this leopards ate their face moment. Sometimes I wonder, like, do people look at the higher taxes that they got taxed this last year when their tax rate went up? If you were middle class and you had to pay more in taxes, I had to pay more. I wonder if they're like, what the hell, Biden? Is like, that was Trump, you idiots. Like, that was Trump's tax plan. You understand that, right? Like, like a real leopards ate my face situation here. Afghanistan, Biden unfairly gets the blame for the pullout of Afghanistan. But now, as we know very well, and this is poignant, I think maybe we could end on this, stepping on the graves of Arlington soldiers, Green Beret no less. Not that any soldier's life is more than another's, but somehow that just feels like it's a little extra. It's the vinegar on it. We lost 13 soldiers during the pullout of Afghanistan, directly due to many of the decisions that the Trump administration made to weaken our position in Afghanistan. We had a drawdown from something like 20,000 troops to 2,500 troops that we just left. And we knew we had reports the Taliban was growing. And Trump released 5,000 Taliban soldiers. There was a hostage swap, and we released 5,000 Taliban soldiers, many of which were part of that were involved in the offensive that they had when they were taking over Afghanistan from us. So we were left in a position where Biden had to pull out, or he had to send more troops in, which he wasn't going to do that, because that would have been, can you imagine Biden, the amount of shit the Republicans would have given him for having to send in 10,000 troops to go fix the situation that no, it was impossible because we knew we were getting reports that Russia was going to fucking invade Ukraine at the same time, and that we had to pull those troops out because we were going to lose complete support for those troops in that area. All of this was the groundwork was put forth by President Trump. And then this week we got to see him stand on the graves of the very soldiers who died from that pullout, from the decisions he made and his administration did that made us militarily ineffective within the Middle East.
Let it be known, we might hold a grudge.
Yeah.
Let it be known. Our position on our contemporary politics and the options that we have for candidates and the discussions we've had on Project 2025, let it be known, this is not from some radicalized left-wing point of view. Let it be known, this is a natural history, and it is a natural history that we feel very passionate about. I think it's obvious in our work that the armed forces and the armed forces of this country have historically not been treated very well. In this time, we are treated the best that we ever have. And our fight is not over with. The battlefield transfers from being against our enemies, foreign and domestic, to being against our enemies, domestic.
Yeah. And we've traded our weapons and all that stuff for the power of words and using our First Amendment right, freedom of speech, to fight those enemies the way that we're supposed to, with the right kind of discourse and through truth and objective fact and reality as much as we can. So
we fully believe that in the economy of ideas, that our ideas are the most valuable, and we have reasons for why they are very valuable.
So this one needs to go to the bathroom again.
All right.
See if she's...
Shall we wrap it up?
Yep. I'm going to have to let her go. So anyways, yeah, I've had such an enjoyable time with these last two episodes, of course. We really got into it. And I think we're going to have to get into World War II a little bit this next time, but I think we can kind of breeze right through it. We'll just say World War II happened. Everyone knows about World War II. Maybe we could just kind of touch on a little things that were happening, but
it's so funny you say it that way. I know your tongue is in your cheek about that. Exactly. Yes, we're going to talk about World War II, audience. Brace yourselves. We might have a stopover in that period of time.
I'm going to try to just breeze through it, because you and I've watched so much World War II documentaries, and I've seen Band of Brothers like 8 million times, and all kinds of World War II movies, because there's been a million of really good ones from and series from the Pacific. I feel like it's almost like we kind of have to breeze through it. I'd like to just kind of talk about economically what was happening, but we'll find out. We'll see. So
let's make our game plan later. Let's get your pooch outside.
Those poor, yeah. All right. I'll talk to you later, Richard. Have a good one.
All right, dude. I'll see you.
All right. Bye.